Alright, for the backdrop, we're going to start out with the basic blue violet that we had before. It's a light wash. Work our way, and as we get closer to the actual edge of the quilt, we're going to go with this blue-black mixture here. Also keeping it fairly light, but getting more opaque as we get closer to the couch to help pop that couch off. Okay, we can use a larger brush here with a larger load. Will help us move quickly to put the pigment on the paper. Definitely want to start out light. Nice swirly motions might add some good texture. Don't necessarily need it to be flat. You want to have a little interesting texture to your paper. Leave some gaps near the edges of the paint that you're doing, like this here. Makes it look very intentional and conscious that you're stepping into this world, but you're defining the border of this world using the paintbrush. You could paint it all over the edge, that's fine too. I'm kind of going for a bit more wistful kind of experience if I can pull it off. Using a little dry brush technique near the edge will help to do that. Like that. Kind of fades off into nothing. Okay. And you'll want to be careful because you're putting on this much watercolor that it can get puddly. And that does make a nice texture. Don't really want that texture here. So I went ahead and laid in the black here on both sides. I also forgot to do the blue background over here. So now we have a very light object, and it's haloed by a nice dark background. We have the blue violet, which is the same blue violet used in the quilt. So it adds a nice harmony across the whole painting. And same thing on this side. But it's asymmetrical. If you notice, we have this nice rounded white object here, and then a dark edge over here. Asymmetry is always fun. And then we have this object here, which is darker than the quilt in the middle. So a nice play on curves as the lights and darks sit on top of each other. Okay, for the next phase of the project here, we're going to be using Prismacolors. And it's really just for detail work, polishing work, sort of finish off the subtleties in the painting to tighten it up. So this is these are very thin sub-brand of Prismacolor. You can buy individual Prismacolors if you want to. I just happen to have this as a gift from someone, so I thought I'd try out the pack. We're going to be mainly using darks to tighten up the skin tones and that sort of stuff. So all I'm really going to be doing here, for the most part, is following along the lines that initially built out the model to help pull her off the paper a little bit, as well as add some details here and there to polish off the piece of artwork. So for example, to really help define the model against the edge of the paper, I want a bit of a darker seam between the model and the paper. Now I could have done this with watercolor as well. It just so happens that I like to work with Prismacolors. It's probably my favorite medium. So I try to work them in where I can. What they give you versus what a watercolor can give you is a very defined tip. You have a ton of control with something like coloring pencils, like Prismacolors. And it's almost always opaque. I mean, what you're adding on there is an opaque surface for the most part because it's wax. So it's good for defining very tight details quickly, very quickly. add, I had forgotten before, the baby's hair. Do on this painting is add some of the highlights. We've had a lot of shadows in there to help pop out some of the things, which is nice, but we do need some highlights to help round out some of the surfaces. Normally what you try to do with watercolor is let the white of the paper show through. So we were able to accomplish that really well here on this arm, on the chest area. That came out pretty well. Not so much in some of the other areas. Particularly on the thighs here, they could have been as luminescent as the arms, but they weren't. So I went back with a damp paper cut towel, just like one of these here, and I wet it and then I smeared and pulled off some of the paint. And that works out pretty well, but unfortunately you never can quite go back to the original white. So keep that in mind. So I pulled some of that paint off of the thighs here to help brighten those up. And now what I'm going to do, I'm not going to do that with the baby because it's so small. Instead I just have some white paint here and just a round brush. And I got a little bit of a water mix with the paint so that it's kind of translucent. And I'm just going to start touching up some of the areas on the baby to add some highlights to his skin to help round him out just a little bit more. And we're just going to kind of add little highlights here and there, remembering where the surface of remember where our light direction's over here. So most of the lighting that we add, the white areas, are going to be with on the top left side of the hands, or top left side of the body. One of the things that we want to do on some of the subtle details of the face here, she initially looked like her eyes were closed as opposed to looking down at the baby. And there wasn't a whole lot of subtle face shading in here. So I've come in and a little more, using the Prismacolor, add a little more eyelash to help soften out the eyelashes, and a little shading that's comparable to the shading in the photo under the eye, on the eyelid. And shaping out her nose a little bit too, bringing in some of that shading, the mouth line. And she also has just a small smile going on as she's looking down at her baby. So add a little darkness right at the corner of the mouth, and also you can lay a little pencil on top of the upper lip, which adds some shading under that upper lip to help contrast it with the bottom lip. And that adds a bit more detail to the face and makes it more comparable to the model's actual features. So you have to look closer at your model's photos when you're doing these. There's a little shadow under her eye here. Remember, this is a very toothy paper, so you're going to have to work at getting into those crevices of the paper, because the Prismacolor is meant to be used on a very smooth surface. And since watercolor is definitely not a smooth surface, you want to go in and be patient as you put in the shading into that toothy paper. So a little bit of shading here on the cheek. Okay, remember, if you don't do that, it's going to look like the model is dirty. It won't look like a shadow. It'll look like the model is dirty. Bring out the fold in her lip just a little bit. Shading right around the eyes. You can do the same thing by using watercolor to layer in those shadows. It so happens the watercolor will lay a little more smoothly, but you also have a little less control over the brush. That is, out of the gate, unless you're really good. You have a little less control than you do with something like a Prismacolor.